And later, Jesus said, it's not the outside of the cup that's the problem, it's what's inside the cup. And if we notice even like the 10 Commandments, what does it talk about? It talks about don't covet. So these are things that from within. And so if we solve the motivation problem that comes from within our heart, then we'll solve the behavior problem that is the result of all of that. As we open up today, we'll have a little bit of review because we're at a transition point in the book of Genesis. Up to this point, of course, we've learned about Abraham and his son Isaac and Isaac's son Jacob. And Jacob ended up going to have 11 and now 12 sons. And if you remember, he was playing favorites with his wife. He loved Rachel more than Leah. And that has created a series of problems that are going to play out for the rest of the book. In chapter 32, Jacob wrestled with God. In chapter 33, he reconciles with his brother Esau. In 34, Jacob's daughter gets molested by some locals, and the sons respond by tricking and then murdering the entire community. So there's a lot of sin in everybody involved in the stories here. In chapter 35, God speaks with Jacob and tells him to go back to Bethel to purify himself. And then we saw last time there was an entire chapter 36 that gave a genealogy of Esau. So starting in the chapter of today, the chapter of Genesis 37, we have Joseph now, and the rest of the book is mainly going to focus on Joseph. And today he's going to have some dreams, and we're going to learn how that comes across to his brothers. So, Steve, if you could start in Genesis 37 and read the first 11 verses.
Now Jacob lived in the land where his father had sojourned, in the land of Canaan. These are the records of the generations of Jacob. Joseph, when 17 years of age, was pasturing the flock with his brothers while he was still a youth, along with sons of Bilhah and the sons of Zilpah, his father's wives. And Joseph brought back a bad report about them to their father. Now Israel loved Joseph more than all his sons because he was the son of his old age, and he made him a varicolored tunic. His brothers saw that their father loved him more than all his brothers, and so they hated him and could not speak to him on friendly terms. Then Joseph had a dream, and when he told it to his brothers, they hated him even more. He said to them, "Please listen to this dream which I've had. For behold, we were binding the sheaves in the field, and lo, my sheaf rose up and stood erect. And behold, your sheaves gathered around and bowed down to my sheaf." Then his brothers said to him, "Are you actually going to reign over us? Are you really going to rule over us?" So they hated him even more for his dreams and for his words. Now he had still another dream and related it to his brothers and said, "Lo, I have had still another dream, and behold, the sun and the moon and 11 stars were bowing down to me." He related it to his father and to his brothers, and his father rebuked him and said to him, "What is this dream that you have had? Shall I and your mother and your brothers actually come to bow down ourselves before you to the ground?" His brothers were jealous of him, but his father kept the saying in mind.
In this passage, in verse 1, it tells us that they were living in the land that God had promised to Abraham and had also promised to Isaac and had promised to Jacob. So they were back in the land, being in that sense, in God's will. And it's often the case that when Israel is back in the land, then they're closer to God and being in fellowship with God. And when they're outside the land, then they're out of fellowship with God and often disobedient. So Jacob returning to the land shows that he returned to fellowship with God. We learned about that. And then in verse 2, it tells us that Joseph is 17 years old. And so remember, he's younger than his brothers. He is the second to the youngest, so most of them were older than him. And at the end of verse 2, what does Joseph do at the end of verse 2?
Joseph brings back a bad report about his brothers, what they were doing out in the field.
So how would the brothers react to that? What sort of family dynamics going on here when the younger brother comes and gives a bad report to mom and dad about what's going on with the older brothers?
Well, they're not going to like it because it's being reported to their parents. Now, I've heard this talk about that Joseph was a tattletale, but it really doesn't say exactly what they were doing. But if they were doing something that deserved a bad report, then you would expect that somebody would be reporting back to the parents and telling them what they were doing.
Right. Depending on the circumstance, it could be that Joseph needed to tell them, but nevertheless, it's still not going to win over the hearts of the brothers. They're not going to like that. Then in the beginning of verse 3, it says Israel loved Joseph more than all his other sons. So now Israel, Jacob, is being called Israel. So that's the other thing we always have to remember, is that Jacob's name was changed to Israel. And sometimes in the Bible, when it says Israel or Jacob, it could be talking about the individual person or the country. So with this, it's talking about how Israel / Jacob loved Joseph more than all his other sons. So how is that going to contribute to the family dynamic here?
That's also going to cause problems, but I think one reason why Joseph loved him more than the other, or greater than the others, was because that was Rachel's firstborn. That was his first love, Rachel. And this was the firstborn son from Rachel.
Then Jacob, Israel, makes Joseph a coat of many colors, a very colored tunic, our translation said. So coat of many colors. He gives him this fancy colored coat. So all these things are adding to this tension between Joseph and his brothers. The playing the favorites, things like this all add up to this jealousy and hatred between all the older brothers and this younger brother, Joseph. When the problems are caused in a family like this, why would a parent do this, do you think, Steve, when they play these favorites? And what does it end up causing amongst the family when a parent loves one more than, because let's face it, you raise some kids, some of them are difficult to love and some of them are more likable, but a parent has a job of raising all of them in the way that they all need to be raised. So what happens in a family when a father or a mother plays favorites?
It can cause division. Sometimes it does. I think it also maybe enhances among the other siblings, where there might be some minor favoritism towards maybe one sibling, but then they magnify it even more. And sometimes it becomes even greater than what it actually is. Maybe that might be some of the stuff going here. Obviously, like I said, Joseph was the son of Rachel. He is giving this coat or robe, which gives a little bit of a sign that Jacob is thinking more of Joseph than he is of the other sons. And possibly the sons were doing things that they weren't supposed to be doing. Joseph comes back, gives this bad report to them. So it can cause division in the family, but I think sometimes the other siblings help contribute to it as well.
Then we have the situation going on here. Besides all of the multicolored coat, and Joseph was telling on his older brothers and playing favorites, we have here, it says at the end of 4, it says they could not speak to him on friendly terms. They, meaning the older brothers, could not speak to Joseph on friendly terms. If I try to put myself in the shoes of all these older brothers, the playing of favorites is no fault of theirs, that it increased this jealousy, and they were legitimately being discriminated against by the parent. And so I try to have some sympathy here for these older brothers, but it says here they could not speak to him on friendly terms. So here's a question, Steve. If we were the older brothers and we had been legitimately wronged by the parents. They're playing favorites. They're buying him things they never bought me. He's telling on us. Could I still be expected to speak to people in a friendly manner? If we get wronged today, can we still speak to people tactfully and respectfully?
Yes, we should speak to them on friendly terms, especially whenever it's in a family, because families have these dynamics that go on. There's things that happen in families that are a little bit more intimate and more involved because they live together all the time. So if the question is, can a person who has been wronged speak friendly to people who have wronged them outside of the family? Yes, they can. They should do that. Can it be the opposite? Can they also avoid them? That can happen too. But I think within the family, there needs to be given some grace that needs to be given, unless it's just something that the one person who is being shown favor just really, really is egregious in the way that they treat their other siblings.
These brothers were frustrated and angry. And I can't really blame them for being frustrated and angry. What I can blame them for is for not speaking to their brother in friendly terms. Even if we are frustrated and angry, we can still speak to people in a manner that would lower, especially us Christians. We should be the ones to lower the tension in the room. And I always found families will say things to each other that they would never say to people outside the family. It always seems like the people we love, or the people we're closest to, will say the more hurtful things to them than we'd ever say to anybody that is less of a friend. So I find this very interesting and very real, in the sense that that's how a family often acts. Doesn't mean they should act that way. And we as Christians should overcome that. And even though we've been discriminated against, even though we're frustrated, we're angry, we can still help things out by at least tactfully speaking to people in a respectful manner. Then the main part of this are these dreams that he has. And Joseph has these couple of dreams. And so what were the dreams again, Steve?
Two dreams. First one was he looked in a field of wheat that had been gathered together in sheaves. And he says all the other sheaves bowed down to him, that his stood up erect, and all the other sheaves bowed down to him. And then the second dream was that he saw these moon and sun and 11 stars that were circling around this moon and stars. So through both of these, it was clear what the interpretation was that the brothers and the family would be bowing down to Joseph, which, given the circumstances, didn't improve the situation between the brothers and Joseph.
Not only did it not improve it, it made it worse. Verse 8 says the brothers hated Joseph all the more. And in verse 10, he tells about the sun and the stars. His father rebukes him and says, would you expect us to bow down to you? I mean, that's not how things are supposed to work, right? And so it would have been an insult to the parents to suggest, hey, you're going to bow down to me. So not only is it a little bit untactful, a little bit out of line to say it to the brothers, and as you rightfully pointed out, Steve, that's just putting fuel on the fire to their hatred was just increased. But it's really to the level of an insult to a parent to say, parent, you ought to be bowing down to me.
But there is a but in this story there at the end of 11. It says, but Jacob kept these things in mind. In other words, while, he rebuked Joseph, he still pondered them as to, okay, what is this exact meaning? If he's having dreams that we're going to be bowing down to him, it does say that Joseph kept them in mind.
If I try to put myself in the shoes of each of the characters in this account and say, what would be their motivation? Well, Joseph comes across as a little naive. He's younger, so he comes across as a little bit naive and not understanding how his words would affect his family. He says these things, and it just seems like some things it would have been wiser to keep to yourself. Israel Jacob comes across as not understanding how his favoritism will cause strife and division in the family. And then the brothers seem to not care that their hatred will cause division. And they seem blinded by this hatred. They seem to, okay, we don't care if there's division. We're just going to hate our brother because of these things that's happened. So the favoritism and the dreams add to the hatred and jealousy that the brothers had for Joseph. So we're really causing some major family divisions here. And so that's what's going on so far. Now, Steve, before we read this next section, I just want to point out something that's from a big picture here that I found interesting. The life of Joseph parallels that of the life of Jesus. There's many aspects of Joseph's life that parallel that to Jesus. Joseph had a dream of other people worshiping him, and Jesus is Lord over all creation. Joseph was prophesied to rule over his brothers. Well, Jesus was prophesied to rule over his human brothers, and Jesus will rule over his human brothers in the kingdom. Joseph's father had a special love for him, and God the Father has a special love for Christ. Joseph was sent by his father to his brethren, just as Jesus was sent. And Joseph was hated by his brothers. And likewise, Jesus was hated by his human brothers. So there's many of those. Those are just a few, but there's a lot of parallels between Joseph and Jesus as the Christ. And so I just found that to be quite interesting. So Steve, if you could start at verse 12 and read down through verse 36, we find out how the brothers react to this.
Then his brothers went to pasture their father's flock in Shechem. Israel said to Joseph, "Are not your brothers pasturing the flock in Shechem? Come, and I will send you to them." And he said to them, "I will go." Then he said to him, "Go now and see about the welfare of your brothers and the welfare of the flock, and bring word back to me." So he sent him from the valley of Hebron, and he came to Shechem. A man found him, and behold, he was wandering in the field. And the man asked him, "What are you looking for?" He said, "I'm looking for my brothers. Please tell me where they are pasturing the flock." Then the man said, "They've moved from here, for I heard them say, 'Let's go to Dothan.'" So Joseph went after his brothers and found them at Dothan. When they saw him from a distance and before he came close to them, they plotted against him to put him to death. They said to one another, "Here comes this dreamer. Now then, come and let us kill him and throw him into one of the pits, and we will say, 'A wild beast devoured him.' Then let us see what will become of his dream." But Reuben heard this and rescued him out of their hands and said, "Let us not take his life." Reuben further said to them, "Shed no blood. Throw him into this pit that is in the wilderness, but do not lay hands on him, that he might rescue him out of their hands to restore him to his father." So it came about when Joseph reached his brothers that they stripped Joseph of his tunic, the varicolored tunic that was on him, and they took him and threw him into the pit. Now the pit was empty, without any water in it. Then they sat down to eat a meal, and as they raised their eyes and looked, behold, a caravan of Ishmaelites was coming from Gilead with their camels bearing aromatic gum and balm and myrrh, on their way to bring them down to Egypt. Judah said to his brothers, "What profit is it for us to kill our brother and cover up his blood? Come, let us sell him to the Ishmaelites and not lay our hands on him, for he is our brother, our own flesh." And his brothers listened to him. Then some Midianite traders passed by, so they pulled him up and lifted Joseph out of the pit and sold him to the Ishmaelites for 20 shekels of silver. Thus they brought Joseph into Egypt. Now Reuben returned to the pit, and behold, Joseph was not in the pit, so he tore his garments. He returned to his brothers and said, "The boy's not there. As for me, where am I to go?" So they took Joseph's tunic and slaughtered a male goat and dipped the tunic in the blood. And they sent the varicolored tunic and brought it to their father and said, "We found this. Please examine it to see whether it's your son's tunic or not." Then he examined it and said, "It's my son's tunic. A wild beast has devoured him. Joseph has surely been torn to pieces." So Jacob tore his clothes and put sackcloth on his loins and mourned for his son many days. Then all his sons and all his daughters arose to comfort him, but he refused to be comforted. And he said, "Surely I will go down to Sheol in mourning for my son." So his father wept for him. Meanwhile, the Midianites sold him in Egypt to Potiphar, Pharaoh's officer, the captain of the bodyguard.
So the father Israel had sent the younger son Joseph to find the brothers and check on them in the field, because the brothers had been pasturing the sheep in the field. So he sent, "Go check on your brothers." In verse 17, the brothers originally had the sheep near Shechem, but apparently the grazing was better near Dothan. So there's this little story here of he goes to where they were and they're not there, and a man tells him, "Oh, they went to the next field." So I always ask myself, why in the world would God include that in his holy word? It seems like we could tell the story of Joseph without having this little scene here where he goes to where they were and then doesn't find them and keep going into the next field. So Steve, I have 2 or 3 things here that I think why that would be there, at least lessons we can learn from that. One is that, as we said a minute ago, Joseph is a parallel or a type of Jesus Christ. And what does the New Testament tell us about what Jesus will do when he has a lost sheep?
It says that when there's one lost sheep, he leaves the other 99 and goes after that one lost sheep to find it and bring it back to the fold.
And so we have here Joseph, the Christ figure, going and, or at least a type of Christ, going and looking for the lost. And he keeps looking until he finds them. And so that's a great lesson learned, is that, my friend, if you've wandered, if you're lost, then Jesus will keep looking for you. And we take praise in that. The next thing I learned is that if this were a myth or an allegory, then little historical tidbits like that are just not included. A myth or an allegory is like a parable, and they have a moral point to it. And the things like that just wouldn't be included, because I can sit here and make the analogy because we have the New Testament to compare it to. But back then, they wouldn't have had that. So it just lends the credence of historical accuracy. The other thing I found is that the move of the sheep was God's providence. The move of the sheep was God's providence because it moved the sons nearer to where the trade route is from the Midianites, I believe it was, that would go to the Egypt. And so, Steve, any other lessons on that little part of it?
Yeah, before we move on with the story, I do want to do a little bit of a backtrack. So in our earlier section, Joseph goes and brings a bad report back to his parents about his brothers. What happens in this section when we pick it up? Jacob says, "Hey, Joseph, I want to send you out so that you can go and look and see what your brothers are doing and bring me back a report." So this apparently is something that Jacob had done before. And the other part of a backstory is that, what are these brothers doing? They're scoundrels. Yeah, they don't like their brother and they can't speak to him in peaceful ways, and they're jealous of him and stuff. But he is their brother. And here they are plotting to kill their brother. So the brothers are kind of scoundrels amongst themselves. And so you can see that a bad report might come back based upon some of the things that they were doing. I just think that's a little bit of maybe a little bit of a backtrack and backstory as to what we had talked about before.
So as we see from this backstory, the brothers had this jealousy, this frustration, this hatred for the younger brother. And some of it he brought on himself. But nevertheless, they shouldn't have had this much hatred. Can jealousy result in murder?
It can have it. We had the very first murder of Cain killing Abel. So also remember, at that point, God told Cain, "Hey, you've got to get a control of your emotions because anger is crouching at the door like a tiger." And so, yeah, jealousy can lead to such things as this, as plotting to cause harm, or even in this case, wanting to murder their own sibling.
What does the Bible say about the source of sin? And it always starts within us, right? So what does the Bible teach about the source of sin coming from within us and bringing out fruit later? For example, in the New Testament, in Mark chapter 7, Jesus says this, "For from within, out of the heart of men proceed evil thoughts, adulteries, fornications, murders, thefts, covetousness, wickedness, deceit, lewdness, an evil eye." And he goes on and says, all these evil things come from within and defile a man. And later, Jesus said, it's not the outside of the cup that's the problem, it's what's inside the cup. And if we notice even like the 10 Commandments, what does it talk about? It talks about don't covet. So these are things that from within. And so if we solve the motivation problem that comes from within our heart, then we'll solve the behavior problem that is the result of all of that. And so that's what we're seeing here. The jealousy and the hatred bring the bitter fruit of plotting the murder of their family member. So if we hold that as true, how do we fix this problem of jealousy and that results in murder from within us? How do I solve this internal sin problem?
We have to look to God. We have to look to Jesus Christ. Paul talks over and over again, talking about putting on the Jesus Christ every day. We have to become more Christ-like. As we become more Christ-like, then things such as jealousy and covetousness and things like that fall to the wayside. You know, if anybody had any reason to hate people, it was Jesus Christ, as he was being beaten and tortured and flogged and beard being plucked out. But yet it says he was silent, that he didn't say anything. And as he's actually on the cross, he says, "Father, forgive them, for they don't know what they do." So Jesus Christ is our model. We're told to be more like Jesus Christ. And as we become more like Jesus Christ, then it takes care of these feelings of animosity that we have for other people.
So in this story, these brothers are plotting murder against their own family member. And when they end up selling him into slavery, then they lie to cover up the problem they just created, the selling to slavery. Reuben, the oldest brother, has some second thoughts, talks them out of murdering him and says, let's just throw him into a pit, with the idea that he's going to come back later and get him. So the older one is starting to show at least a hint of responsibility here. And Reuben was the oldest, so must be getting a little bit of maturity anyways. Reuben didn't want to go along with the crowd. He didn't want to go along with the crowd, but he kind of halfway goes along with the crowd. What he didn't do was stand up firm and say, fellas, this is wrong. Yes, we have justification for being frustrated with our brother, but murdering him's wrong, selling him into slavery is wrong. We're not going to do that. So, but he didn't do that. He realized it was wrong what they were planning, but he halfway goes along with it. So my question is, how difficult is it to stand for what's right when everyone else around us is going wrong?
That is the lesson from this situation with Reuben. Because he doesn't stand up on the spot, he has this idea, good-hearted idea, I'll come back later and get Joseph out of this pit after my brothers aren't here. Because he doesn't stand up at the time, then the brother gets sold. So that's a lesson out of this. Not only should you stand up in these situations, but you should stand up right away. Don't think that you're going to come back later and correct the situation, because the situation might not be the same situation later that it was at the time that you had an opportunity to stand up. And how does it affect Reuben? Reuben knows that he's the oldest. He has the responsibility of taking care of all of his brothers. He knows that he's in a world of trouble with his father, Jacob, because now Joseph, the father's favorite, is gone, has been sold into slavery.
That's exactly the problem. Is Reuben here knew what was right and knew what was wrong and should have been the one to stand up with authority and say, no, I am not going to participate in this. And I'm asking you not to do it either, because I will not participate in something that's wrong. And it's difficult for him. And it's difficult for all of us, but we need to, especially those of us that know the Lord, need to have enough of a moral compass to know that what God wants and what God doesn't want. And even though all the rest of the world is going the wrong direction, we should be the one to stand up and say, no, I'm going to go in the right direction. Then in verse 26, the brothers get to thinking, hey, we could make some money here if we sell Joseph into slavery. So now they're motivated by greed. What problems can be solved by or caused by greed?
What is the proverb? The root for the love of money is the root of all evil. People want to misrepresent that and say that the money's the root of all evil, but no, it's the love of money is the root of all evil. That's greed. That's a definition of what greed is. Greed causes problems because it puts thoughts in action. You've got to come up with some sort of an action to achieve whatever the greediness is making you desire. That's the problem. Just like with jealousy, it brings to mind things to do to solve the jealousy or what you think is going to solve the jealousy. Same thing with greed. It brings things to mind in order to satisfy the greediness. And most of the time, if not all the time, the actions that come out of both wanting to solve jealousy and to satisfy the greed are not godly actions. They're things that are against God. And in this case, they're selling their brother.
They sell their brother for 20 pieces of silver. So my question is, how much is a human life worth? How much is a family worth? 20 pieces of silver? I submit that the value of the human and the value of a family cohesiveness is priceless. And that this jealousies that go on, especially if we sell out our family members, whatever we get for it's not enough, because the love in a family is of infinite value. And the family will be there for you if you have but love in the family.
You're also talking about the comparison between Joseph and Jesus. Jesus was also sold out for money.
Right. And that's another one of the parallels. So in this, Israel's sons take the coat, kill a young goat, and use that to deceive Israel, Jacob. So remember earlier, Jacob, with his father, used a goat skin to deceive his father Isaac. So Jacob deceived his father, and Jacob's sons deceived their father. What we sow, we will also reap. Jacob didn't get away with it, because yet again, what he sowed way back when he was fooling his father, he's been deceived and multiple times. So the law of sowing and reaping says we reap what we sow, and we reap more than we sow. So that has come to fruition here. In verse 34 and 35, Jacob believes his son has suddenly died and is emotionally broken. He's completely distraught. The sons and daughters try to comfort him, but they could not. Jacob, at this point, is a broken man. Verse 35, Jacob says he's going to die, an emotionally broken man. And so he is totally distraught. But think of this, Steve. What has he got? He's at this point, he believes his son is dead, which is a great tragedy. And not trying to minimize that when somebody loses a son. But look at what he has left. He's got 11 sons, a daughter, 3 wives, grandchildren. He's got a lot of flocks. He needs to be emotionally healthy enough to be valuable to his family that he has left, and to still do God's work on earth. If he crawls inside of his desperation and shrivels up to die, He's not going to be any good to his family. In fact, he'd be a burden to his family, and he sure won't be any good to the Lord's work. So when people are emotionally broken, how do they view past that and see, hey, I've got some things left? I mean, we heard, Steve, not long ago from a lady whose son died suddenly and tragically, and that's a great tragedy. But look at what we have left. As long as we're still breathing, we can do the Lord's work, and not minimizing the pain of losing a child. But I do want to say, if that ends you, then you're not able to do the Lord's work. And Jacob here doesn't see the end of the story. It ends up turning into a great blessing. But at this point, he's just a broken man. So how do we get past the emotional pain to be able to see, hey, God's still working here, and God still has some things for me to do, and I've still got a family here that I'm responsible for, that I can be a benefit to raising these kids and these grandkids.
I can empathize with Jacob's pain. He's lost his first love, Rachel. She's died in childbirth of Benjamin. So his first love is gone. Now, the secondary to that, his firstborn son from his first love, Rachel, is gone. And he thinks not just gone, but it actually is as deceased. That's what he's thinking. So I can empathize with this torment that he has, this great pain that he has. But I can also say through this empathy that you have to go on. And the thing is that the way that you can get out of it is to serve the Lord. That might seem against what you should do or would want to do, but there's great joy in serving the Lord. And it's a way that you can move closer to the Lord in these type of situations. It gives you a purpose of what to do. I would also encourage others to ensure that their loved ones have salvation in Jesus Christ, because through that, we know that we will see them again whenever we pass on. So that gives great comfort of knowing that we're going to see them again, that we're going to be united with them again. So if your loved ones are not believers and you haven't spoken to them about that, do it. Become believers and also speak to them, your loved ones. Do it. Today's the day of salvation. That way, if something tragic like this happens within a family, you at least have that hope to get you on that we're going to be reunited someday.
At the end of chapter 37, we have Jacob is an emotionally broken man. He is distraught because of the loss of his son. We have Joseph, meanwhile, is on his way to Egypt. He gets there, he gets sold as a slave to the captain of the bodyguard to Pharaoh. So we have God's providential hand working here. It's just that none of the characters can see it. Joseph is right where God wants him, and he's going right where God's going to use him. But I'm sure if you ask anybody in this story at this point, all they would see is negativity and pain. But yet God's hand of providence is working out something very, very good. And so that's where the story is. Next time we get to chapter 38, we're going to have a side story that many people question, why in the world is it here? But we're going to see a very valuable lesson when we get to Judah and Tamar in chapter 38.
As always, we thank you so much for watching and listening. May God bless you.